On the morning that you cross from Oban to Mull on the ferry, the island appears at first as a long, dark line on the horizon, the mountains of its interior receding in layers toward a sky that is almost always doing something interesting with cloud and light. As the ferry rounds the headland at Cregnure and enters the Sound of Mull, the castle becomes visible. It is perched on a black volcanic promontory at the exact point where the sound opens into the Firth of Lorne and Loch Linnhe, the junction of three major seaways, and it watches you arrive. It has been watching people arrive for 800 years. This is Duart Castle, Castial Dubhert in Gaelic, the castle on the Black Point. The name is precise. The basalt promontory on which it stands was dark before the castle was built, and the castle that was built on it caught the same dark quality. Thick walls of grey-black stone, heavy and low-slung against the sky, with none of the romantic spiring that makes certain Scottish castles look theatrical. Duart looks functional. It looks like a building that was built to do a specific job, to watch the sea, to hold the headland, to make a family's claim over the most important maritime junction on the west coast of Scotland, physical and permanent. The castle has done more than watch. It has been besieged by Campbells, occupied by Cromwell's navy, abandoned for 2 centuries, and restored by a clan chief at the age of 75 who bought back his family's ruins and spent the rest of his life making them habitable again. It has been the base from which a MacLean chief, Lachlan Moore, Big Lachlan, extracted military service from a Spanish Armada ship sheltering in Tobermory Bay, and then arranged for the ship to blow up. It has watched the body of Red Hector of the battles carried to Iona. It has the rock in the water below it where, in the 1520s, a MacLean chief tied his wife to drown, and from which she was rescued by a passing boat, and to which she returned home as if nothing had happened, and waited for her husband in the Great Hall. The castle at the junction of the sea lanes is where everything happened on the west coast of Scotland, and where it kept happening, in different combinations of the same actors, for 7 centuries. This is that history. The specific combination of things that Duart can show you is unusual even among the major Scottish castles. There is the rock in the water, visible from the castle window, where a MacLean chief tied his wife to drown and watched from the battlements the next morning for the body. There is the ghost of the Spanish Armada galleon in Tobermory Bay, still sought by treasure hunters, still generating disputes about what it was carrying and who blew it up. There is Red Hector of the battles, carried to Iona. There is the castle that resisted Campbell's siege in 1647 and succumbed to Campbell debt in 1679. There is the 75-year-old clan chief who bought back his ruin in 1911. All of this happened at, or was shaped by, the Black Point at the mouth of the Sound of Mull. None of it was quiet. Some castles have 2 stories, the one they tell you at the gate and the one buried in the record. I've put 24 of those castles in a book. Castles of myth and blood, the murders at weddings, the dungeon behind the chapel wall, the legends that collapse the moment you check a date. If you want to discover what the tours leave out, scan the code on screen or click the link in the description. Chapter 1, Dub R.D., The Black Point and the World Before the Castle, Prehistory to 1250. The Sound of Mull is one of the most strategically important stretches of water on the west coast of Scotland. It runs approximately 30 miles between the island of Mull to the southwest and the mainland peninsula of Morvern to the northeast, connecting the open waters of the Firth of Lorne at its southern end to the junction with Loch Linnhe at its northern end, where the sea route continues both northward to the Great Glen and westward to Ardnamurchan and the outer Hebrides. Any vessel moving between the Hebrides and the mainland ports of the west coast, between the MacDonald territories and the Campbell heartlands, between Ireland and the ports of Argyll, between the Norse settlements of the Northern Isles and the trading towns of the lowlands, moved through the Sound of Mull, or went far out of its way to avoid it. The promontory at the southern end of the Sound, where it opens into the Firth of Lorne, commanded all of this. Whoever held the Black Point of Duart could watch everything that moved through the most important maritime junction on the west coast of Scotland. They could signal to other stations along the coast using beacon fires. Duart was part of a chain of signal stations running from Dunolly near Oban in the south to Duart Castle on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula in the north, a communications network that allowed information about approaching threats to travel faster than any ship. And, if they had artillery or archers, or simply the determination to make use of the position, they could levy tribute on passing traffic, deny the sound to their enemies, and project power over the surrounding waters. This was known long before anyone built a castle there. The evidence for prehistoric activity on the headland is circumstantial, but consistent with what archaeologists find at other commanding coastal positions in the Western Highlands. Flint tools, traces of burning, the kind of scattered human debris that accumulates at places where people repeatedly stop, because stopping there makes strategic sense. The Black Point was used before it was fortified, watched before it was walled, important before anyone made a permanent statement of importance in stone. The name in Gaelic tells you what matters. Duart, the Black Point, or the Dark Height. The basalt is genuinely black, a volcanic rock that weathers dark and holds its dark color even in the gray light that characterizes this part of Argyll for much of the year. It does not blend into the landscape, it contrasts with it. On a clear day, the castle on its headland is visible from extraordinary distances across the water, from the hills of Morvern across the Sound, and from the approaches through the Firth of Lorne from the south. It is a landmark as much as a fortress, and in the age of galley navigation, the ability to see your destination from 20 miles away was not a trivial thing. The Isle of Mull itself, the second largest island of the Inner Hebrides, approximately 351 square miles of volcanic rock, blanket bog, and mountain, had been inhabited since the Mesolithic period. The communities who lived there in the early medieval period were Gaelic-speaking descendants of the Dalriata settlement that had established itself across the Western Highlands and Islands from the 5th century onward. They fished, farmed the coastal strips of fertile land, cut peat from the bogs, and moved constantly between the island and the mainland by boat. The sea was their road. The promontory at Duart was their clearest view of the road. The word for the castle in Gaelic, Castell Duart, preserves the original description of the place, which predates any castle, the Dark Height. The adjective dub appears in many Scottish place names as a description of visual reality rather than metaphor. The black hills, the dark lochs, the basalt headlands that the geology of volcanic Scotland generated across the western coastline. At Duart, the darkness is real. The basalt rock on which the castle stands is genuinely, uniformly dark, neither the warm gray of granite nor the lighter limestone of the interior. On a morning with cloud cover and wind across the Sound, the headland is almost black. The approach to Mull from Oban on the modern ferry replicates, in compressed form, what every visitor to the Western Highlands experienced for centuries. You cross the Firth of Lorne from the mainland port. The island becomes progressively more present as you approach, and then the Sound of Mull opens ahead of you, and the castle appears at its junction with the Firth. Every chieftain who visited the MacLeans at Duart, every government emissary, every Campbell negotiator, every raiding force, every supply ship, every vessel passing through on its way north or south, all of them saw the same thing at the same moment, in the same approach. The castle appearing at the junction of the waters, the Dark Point, the building that said, "This is where we are, and we are watching." Chapter 2. The MacDougals, the Bruce, and the castle's first stones, 1250 to 1350. The earliest stone fortification at Duart was built in the 13th century, and the family most likely responsible was the MacDougals of Lorne, the same family that built the first fortification at the Castle Stalker site, and that produced the brooch of Lorne from Robert the Bruce's own cloak at the Battle of Dalry in 1306. The MacDougals were the dominant power in Argyll in this period descendants of Somerled's son Dougal, with their principal seat at Dunstaffnage Castle, and their authority extending over the sea lanes of the entire region. The early castle at Duart was not yet a tower house. The Royal Commission on Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland recorded its original form as a rectangular wall of enceinte, a curtain wall cutting off the end of the promontory and enclosing a courtyard approximately 20 meters from northwest to southeast and 21 meters across. One or more sides of this courtyard may have been occupied by lean-to buildings of stone or timber. The entrance was in the southwest curtain wall. This was the standard form of a West Highland coastal fortification of the 13th century. A strong perimeter wall providing a defended enclosure from which sea traffic could be monitored and from which a garrison could resist attack by the limited forces that galley-based enemies could concentrate against a sea-girt headland. The MacDougall decision to build at Duart was the expression of the same strategic logic that had made the Black Point significant for centuries. Control of the junction between the Sound of Mull, the Firth of Lorne, and Loch Linnhe was control of the most important maritime nexus on the west coast. The MacDougalls, whose power rested on galley control of the sea lanes of Argyll, needed to hold this position or leave it to someone who might use it against them. The battle that ended MacDougall power in Argyll was not at Duart, but at the Pass of Brander in 1308, when Robert the Bruce trapped John Bacach MacDougall's forces between Ben Cruachan and Loch Awe, and the Black Douglas attacked from above. John escaped by galley, his father Alexander submitted, and then went into exile. The MacDougall lands in Lorne were forfeited, and Duart, if it was then in MacDougall hands, changed its political affiliation along with everything else in Argyll. The MacLeans, who eventually claimed Duart, traced their descent from a legendary ancestor called Gillian of the Battle Axe, a name that suggests either a specific warrior celebrated for his weapon or a later genealogical invention designed to give the clan a suitably martial origin. Historically, the first MacLeans appear in Argyll in the late 13th century, initially as followers of the MacDougalls, then as independent actors in the turbulent politics of the period. Their claim to Duart came not from conquest, but from marriage, in one of those specifically medieval transactions by which the right combination of personal and political circumstances transferred a major fortification from one family to another through the medium of a dowry. The MacDougall fortification on the Duart headland was part of a wider network of coastal castles that controlled the Sound of Mull and the approaches to the western Highlands. Dunolly near Oban, Mingarry on Ardnamurchan, Cairnburg in the Treshnish Isles, these were the nodes of a system that the MacDougalls, at the height of their power, used to project authority across the sea routes of Argyll and the Hebrides. Duart was one of the most important of these nodes precisely because of its position at the junction of three major waterways. Control here meant control of the whole southern sound. The MacDougall loss of this position to Robert the Bruce's alliance was therefore not merely a military defeat, but a strategic one. It removed from MacDougall hands the most commanding maritime position in their territory, at the moment when their political survival depended on their ability to hold the western sea lanes against a king who was rapidly consolidating control of Scotland. The MacDougalls who built Duart and the MacLeans who rebuilt it were both responding to the same geographical logic. The headland made the castle made the position was worth everything. The transition period between MacDougall construction and MacLean rebuilding, roughly the first half of the 14th century, when the castle's ownership was politically unsettled, left the existing curtain walls on the headland without the major new construction that MacLean ambition would eventually generate. The rectangular courtyard enclosure that the MacDougalls had built was functional but not grand. A strong perimeter wall, some lean-to buildings against the inner face, an entrance in the southwest wall. For a family with the MacLean pretensions to the region's lordship, this was insufficient. Chapter 3. Lachlan Lubanach and the Marriage That Made the MacLeans, 1350 to 1411. Lachlan Lubanach. MacLean, Lachlan the Wily, or Lachlan the Cunning, a nickname that suggests a diplomatic rather than a purely military character, was the fifth, chief of Clan MacLean, and the man who brought Duart permanently into the MacLean family. The mechanism was his marriage to Mary MacDonald, daughter of John of Islay, who was the Lord of the Isles. The Lord of the Isles was, in the 14th century, one of the most powerful figures in Scotland, the ruler of a maritime empire that included the Hebrides and much of the western Highlands, a lord who dealt with the kings of Scotland and England as an approximate equal, and who maintained his independence through the same combination of galley power and strategic positioning that the MacDougalls had exercised before the Bruce destroyed them. A marriage alliance with the Lord of the Isles was the most advantageous political connection available to any West Highland chief in this period, and Lachlan Lubanach obtained it. The dowry included Duart. The first known charter for the castle, dated 1390, confirms MacLean ownership as a consequence of this marriage alliance. But Lachlan's path to this marriage was, according to the castle's own history, neither simple nor free of violence. Mary MacDonald's father was reluctant to agree to the match, and Lachlan, displaying the specific character suggested by his nickname, resolved this reluctance by kidnapping the Lord of the Isles. In the incident during which the kidnap occurred, the chief of the MacKinnons was killed. The Lord of the Isles was persuaded. The marriage went ahead. The MacKinnon lands were added to the dowry, and thus the MacLeans came to own much of Mull. The castle that Lachlan built at Duart was the tower house that forms the core of the present structure. When it was decided to enlarge the castle toward the end of the 14th century, following its acquisition by the MacLeans, the northwest portion of the promontory was cleared, and the site was used for the erection of a substantial tower house built directly against the outer face of the existing 13th-century curtain wall. The tower comprised a ground-floor cellar and 3 upper stories, the first floor occupied by a hall. The walls were very solid. Those on the outer seaward sides were heavily buttressed against the wind and salt spray that the exposed headland attracted, while the inner southeast wall was built directly against the older curtain wall. The stone used was the local basalt, dark, hard, and abundant on the headland itself. Lachlan also undertook or oversaw the improvement of the castle's defensive infrastructure, including walls whose landward faces were up to 10 feet thick. The thickness was not merely standard military caution. It was a response to the specific conditions of the Sound of Mull, where a lord who had antagonized his neighbors could expect attack from the sea at relatively short notice, and where the castle's garrison needed to be able to hold out until relief arrived by the same route. The sea-facing walls of Duart were somewhat thinner than the landward ones, reflecting the basic calculation that enemies approaching by water were harder to concentrate than those approaching overland, and that the cliff itself provided much of the seaward defense. Lachlan Lubanach died, and his son Red Hector inherited both the castle and the complex web of allegiances and rivalries that came with it. The MacLeans were now firmly part of the Lord of the Isles political alliance, and when Donald of Islay, Lord of the Isles, chose to assert his claim to the earldom of Ross in 1411 by marching an army across Scotland, Hector of Duart went with him as his lieutenant general. The story of Lachlan's kidnapping of the Lord of the Isles to secure his consent to the marriage is preserved in the castle's own history as a founding legend of the MacLean connection to Duart. It has the quality of a West Highland tale, the audacious act, the violence that accompanies it, the MacKinnon chief killed in the incident, the eventual resolution that brings both political advantage and a moral complication. Lachlan the Wily obtained what he wanted through methods that were characteristically direct by West Highland standards of the period. The death of the MacKinnon chief was a consequence that the legend notes without quite condemning. It happened in the course of obtaining a marriage alliance that was both a love match and a political masterstroke, and the MacKinnon lands added to the dowry were a form of compensation that the Gaelic law of the period would have recognized as appropriate. The 1390 charter that confirmed MacLean ownership of Duart was issued by the Scottish Crown, not by the Lord of the Isles, whose authority in the Hebrides was based on military and political reality rather than on formal legal grant. The royal charter gave the MacLeans a claim that the collapse of the lordship of the Isles in 1493 could not entirely extinguish. Whatever happened to the lordship's political structure, the MacLeans held a royal charter for their Mull lands that the Scottish Crown had issued, and that the Scottish Crown would need to specifically revoke rather than simply ignore. This was one of the reasons that MacLean power on Mull survived the collapse of the lordship more intact than many other West Highland families, whose authority rested on lordship rather than royal charter. The keep that Lachlan built on the existing courtyard was designed for the specific conditions of the Sound of Mull. The walls on the outer, seaward faces heavily buttressed, reflecting the combined pressure of Atlantic winds and the need to resist any naval assault that might be mounted from the water. The salt spray that the exposed headland attracts in winter storms would, over time, erode any stonework of insufficient quality, and the builders chose their stone and their construction methods with this in mind. The basalt of the headland itself was the logical source of building material, hard, dark, locally abundant, and with a weathering profile that matched the existing rock on which the castle stood. Chapter 4. Red Hector of the Battles. The Single Combat at Harlaw, 1411. The Battle of Harlaw, fought on 24th July 1411 on the plains of Aberdeenshire near the village of Harlaw, was one of the most significant and most closely fought battles in the history of the medieval Scottish Highlands. The Donald of Islay's army of perhaps 10,000 men, Hebridean warriors and Highland clansmen fighting in their traditional manner, had marched from the northwest of Scotland to within a few miles of Aberdeen before being confronted by a much smaller force of Scottish government troops and lowland levies under the Regent Albany's son. Red Hector of the Battles, Hector Ruadh nan Cath, the sixth chief of Clan MacLean, commanded Donald's right flank. He was, by all the accounts that survive, an extraordinary swordsman, celebrated enough that other knights came specifically to test themselves against him, the kind of warrior whose reputation preceded him across the Western Highlands and who was regarded, even by his enemies, as one of the best fighters of his generation. The Battle of Harlaw gave him the occasion for a combat that passed into legend. In the course of the battle, Hector found himself engaged in single combat with Sir Alexander Irvine, Laird of Duart Castle, and chief of Clan Irvine. Both men were regarded as exceptional swordsmen. The battle continued around them while they fought each other, and witnesses later reported that other soldiers stopped fighting to watch, that the spectacle of these two specific warriors engaged with each other was compelling enough to interrupt the general carnage of a pitched battle in which thousands of men were dying. The combat ended as a draw in the deepest sense. Both men killed each other, their injuries so severe that neither survived the engagement, dying slumped together on the field. Hector's body was carried from Harlaw to the sacred island of Iona, where the ancient Scottish kings were buried, and where the MacLeans had established one of their most important religious connections. The epitaph that tradition preserved for him, Hector Ruadh nan Cath, Red Hector of the Battles, was the kind of Gaelic naming formula that fixed a man in the memory of his clan permanently. He was not simply Hector, he was Hector the Red, and the battles were what defined him, and the battles ended at Harlaw where both men fell. The Battle of Harlaw itself was drawn. The Highland forces withdrew without achieving their objective of capturing Aberdeen, and the Regent's forces did not pursue. The long-term consequences for the MacLeans were largely shaped by what Harlaw implied about the Lord of the Isles' political position. The lordship was powerful enough to challenge the Scottish crown, but not quite powerful enough to defeat it, a balance that would slowly shift against the island lords over the next 80 years. The single combat between Red Hector and Alexander Irvine of Drum is one of the most precisely remembered events in the castle's associated history, and its precision, the specific identification of both combatants, The specific outcome of mutual death, the specific detail of other soldiers stopping to watch, suggests that eyewitnesses found it remarkable enough to record carefully. Medieval battle accounts are generally not precise about individual combats. The carnage of a pitched battle was too chaotic and too distributed for specific fighting to be easily tracked and reported. When medieval sources record a single combat in detail, it is because the participants were sufficiently celebrated that observers were paying specific attention. And Red Hector had the kind of martial reputation that would have drawn eyes. The transport of his body from Harlaw to Iona, a journey of approximately 200 miles from the Aberdeenshire lowlands back across the Highlands to the sacred island, is another detail that the tradition preserves because it was significant. Iona, the burial place of the old Scottish kings, was where the Western Highland aristocracy sent their most important dead. The MacLeans, who carried Red Hector's body the full length of Scotland to bury him there, were making a statement about his status and their own. This was not merely a clan chief who had died in battle, but a man who deserved the honor that kings had received. The castle at Duart, which had sent him south to Harlaw, received the news of his death by the same sea routes, along which his body was carried home. Chapter 5. The Lordship of the Isles and the MacLean Zenith, 1411 to 1493. The 15th century was the period of MacLean power at its height. With their base at Duart, commanding the Sound of Mull and the approaches to the entire western seaboard, the MacLeans were the dominant military force on Mull and among the most significant clan families in the Hebrides. They were technically vassals of the Lord of the Isles, but in practice they governed their domain with the independence of sovereign princes, as a subsequent MacLean history put it, their charter rights confirmed, their military superiority on Mull unchallenged, their strategic position on the Sound giving them influence over every significant movement of sea traffic. Duart in this period was not merely a military installation. It was the administrative center of the MacLean lands, the seat from which justice was administered, tribute collected, alliances negotiated, and the clan's business conducted. The great hall in the Tower House was where chiefs received visitors, hosted other clan leaders, and displayed the kind of hospitality that was simultaneously a social obligation and a political statement in West Highland culture. Generosity was power in the Gaelic tradition. A chief who could feed and entertain his people and his guests well was a chief who had resources, and resources were the foundation of authority. The clans that branched from the MacLean tree in this period, the MacLeans of Coll, the MacLeans of Lochbuie, the MacLeans of Ardgour and Morvern, were all cadet branches originating from Duart, their chiefs acknowledging the primacy of the Duart line as the senior stem. The 1538 episode in which Ewan MacLean of Lochbuie was slain and beheaded in an internal clan battle gives a sense of the violence that could erupt even within the extended family. The headless horseman that legend places in Glenmore, riding through the valley below the mountains of Mull, is the ghost of Ewan looking for his head, and the local tradition preserves his story alongside that of the living clan chiefs at Duart. The collapse of the lordship of the Isles in 1493, when James IV of Scotland finally forfeited John MacDonald's title for the last time, ending the quasi-independent Western Maritime Empire that had operated for over a century, transformed the MacLeans' political situation overnight. They were now directly subject to the Scottish crown, without the buffer of the Lord of the Isles' authority between them and Edinburgh. More practically, the loss of the lordship's political framework meant that the careful balance of alliances that had sustained West Highland peace was gone. The MacLeans were now exposed directly to the expanding power of their most dangerous neighbours, the Campbells of Argyll. The MacLean clan, at the peak of its 15th century power, was not simply the family at Duart, but a network of related families across the Western Highlands and Islands whose economic activities, trading, raiding, fishing, farming, providing galley service to other lords, gave the clan as a whole resources that a single family's estates could not have sustained. The MacLeans of Cole managed the fertile island of Cole. The MacLeans of Tiree worked the Macaire of Scotland's westernmost inhabited island. The MacLeans of Lochby held the southern part of Mull from their own castle at Moy. The MacLeans of Ardgour and Morvern held mainland territories across the Sound. All of these paid at least nominal acknowledgement to the Duart line. The castle in this period was maintained and improved by successive chiefs, who understood that Duart's military and symbolic function were inseparable. A castle that looked strong was as politically important as a castle that was strong, because in the specific culture of the West Highland lordship system, visible wealth and visible military capability were how a chief communicated his power to those who owed him service and to those who might contemplate challenging him. The great hall at Duart, the dungeons, the buttressed seaward walls, these were all simultaneously functional elements of a defensive structure and signs of the MacLean chiefs standing in the hierarchy of West Highland power. The specific internal clan conflict of 1538, in which Ewan MacLean of Lochby was slain and beheaded in an internal battle, illustrates the degree to which even the extended MacLean family was not immune to the violence that characterized West Highland political life. The legend of the Headless Horseman of Glenmore is the story of Ewan's ghost, riding through the valley below the mountains of Mull without his head, looking for something he can never find. The ghost stories attached to the MacLean lands are not decorative additions to a more rational history. They are the emotional residue of a culture in which violent death was sufficiently routine to require both commemoration and explanation. Chapter 6. Lachlan Catnac and Lady's Rock, the marriage that became a murder attempt, 1493 to 1527. The 11th chief of Clan MacLean was Lachlan Catnac, Lachlan the Shaggy, or Hairy, a nickname referring to his physical appearance. He was born at Duart Castle around 1465 and ruled from 1513, succeeding his father after the clan lost its 9th chief, Hector Oder, at the disastrous Battle of Flodden alongside James IV. The MacLeans of Duart were already weakened when Lachlan Catnac inherited, and the political situation facing him required diplomatic skill that his nickname does not necessarily suggest. In the period after the lordship of the Isles' collapse, the most powerful force in western Scotland was the Campbells of Argyll, a family whose systematic expansion was as much a political and legal program as a military one, using feudal superiority, marriage alliances, and royal favor to accumulate territory and influence that the traditional clan system had not protected against. The MacLeans needed a Campbell alliance. The Campbell alliance required a Campbell marriage. Lachlan Catnac married Catherine Campbell, sister of the Earl of Argyll. The marriage did not work. The accounts that survive give different emphasis to what went wrong. Some stress Lachlan's violent temperament and his frustration at Catherine's failure to produce a male heir. Others preserve a counter-tradition in which Catherine attempted to poison her husband at a banquet in the Great Hall at Duart, and that Lachlan's subsequent revenge was a response to this perceived first act of hostility. Both traditions may be partially accurate. The marriage between two people from families with deep structural reasons to distrust each other, in a period when the political calculus that had made the marriage necessary was already failing, was probably not a relationship in which either party found much that was personally satisfactory. What is agreed is that Lachlan had his wife taken out at night to a small rock in the Sound of Mull, a skerry called Craig and Whiskey, submerged at high tide, and left there to drown when the tide came in. He looked out from Duart Castle the following morning, saw the rock was empty, and sent word to the Earl of Argyll at Inverary that his sister had unfortunately died. He then prepared a coffin and an entourage and went to Inverary in person to deliver the appropriate condolences and to accompany the body to burial. Catherine was sitting at the head of the table when he arrived. A passing boat, some accounts say from Tyvalich, others from Lismore, had heard cries from the rock during the night and rescued her. she had returned to her brother's castle. Argyll received Lachlan in his great hall, permitted the meal and the condolences to proceed, and allowed Lachlan to leave. Nothing was said. The dinner continued, and then Argyll planned his revenge. The scary offshore from Duart Castle is still called Lady's Rock. It is submerged at high tide and carries a navigation beacon. Visitors to the castle can see it from the castle windows on the seaward side, exactly as the MacLean history preserves the detail. Lachlan Catenac looked from his castle window and saw the rock devoid of life, and thought his wife was gone. Lachlan was murdered in his bed in Edinburgh. The year most often given is 1523. The man who killed him was Sir John Campbell of Calder, Catherine's brother, not Argyll himself, but a Campbell fulfilling the obligation of revenge that the family honor demanded. The death in bed in Edinburgh, rather than in battle on the Western Sea, was itself a statement. The Campbells had reached him even in the lowland capital, and the long arm of Campbell revenge was not confined to the territory where MacLean military power might have offered some protection. He was succeeded by Hector More, Hector the Great, who inherited not only the clan, but the feud with the Campbells that his father's homicidal impulse had made permanent. The Lady's Rock story is the episode that most visitors to Duart Castle remember, partly because the rock itself is still there and still visible from the castle windows, and partly because the specific dramatic quality of the story, the attempted murder, the rescue, the return, the dinner table confrontation, the delayed revenge, has a narrative structure that feels almost novelistic. The historical detail that has been preserved across 5 centuries of retelling is extraordinary. The specific manner of the attempt, tied to a tidal rock at night, the specific route of her rescue, by a passing boat, the specific occasion of her reappearance, seated at the head of the table when her husband arrived to offer condolences for her death, and the specific restraint of the Campbell response. The meal proceeded as if nothing had happened before Lachlan was allowed to leave. The accounts disagree on some details, whether Catherine had attempted to poison Lachlan first, whether the rock was in the Sound of Mull or the Firth of Lorn, whether the rescue came from Lismore or Tayvallich, but agree on the essential sequence. The disagreement about whether Catherine struck first is historically interesting. If the poisoning attempt at the banquet in Duart's Great Hall is historical, then the Lady's Rock episode becomes a reciprocal escalation in a mutual attempt at spousal murder rather than simple unilateral male violence, which would make the story considerably more morally complex than the traditional telling suggests. What is not disputed is the consequence. Lachlan Catenac was murdered in his bed in Edinburgh. The Campbell brother who killed him was conducting a legitimate revenge by the standards of the period's honor culture. His sister had been left on a rock to drown, and the man who had done this could not simply be allowed to continue as if nothing had happened. The murder in Edinburgh, far from Mull, in the lowland capital where Lachlan's island military power could not protect him, demonstrated that the Campbells' reach was not confined to the west. It also demonstrated the specific danger that the Campbell family represented to the MacLeans. Not merely a rival clan with military power on the adjacent territory, but a family with political connections extending to the center of Scottish power, capable of reaching their enemies wherever those enemies went. The history of the MacLean-Campbell conflict that Lachlan Catenac's actions made inevitable is the central thread of the castle's subsequent history. It runs from the 1520s through the debt crisis of the 1670s to the surrender of 1691 and the demolition of the walls that followed. A chief who had chosen a diplomatic marriage specifically to reduce tension with the most powerful family in western Scotland, and who then attempted to murder his wife as a solution to a domestic problem, had traded away the most valuable political asset the MacLeans possessed. The consequences took 2 centuries to work out fully, but they were determined in the great hall of Duart Castle, or possibly on the rock below it, sometime in the 1520s. Chapter 7. Hector More, James V, and the direct confrontation with the Crown, 1527 to 1568. Hector More MacLean, the 12th chief, was born at Duart in 1497 and lived until 1568, 71 years that spanned the most dramatic period in Scottish history since the Wars of Independence. He ruled for 45 years, outlasting James IV, who died at Flodden the year of Hector More's childhood, James V, who died in 1542 after the disaster at Solway Moss, Mary Queen of Scots, who was his contemporary through his final decade, and the Reformation that tore Scottish religious and political life apart in the middle of his tenure. Hector More's early years as chief were dominated by the aftermath of his father's action, and by the structural conflict between the MacLeans' independence and the Scottish Crown's growing determination to bring the Western clans to heel. James V was a different kind of Scottish king from his predecessors, personally interested in the Hebrides, willing to travel there in person with a naval force to make his authority felt, and unwilling to leave the Western Islands as the effectively autonomous domain they had been under the lordship of the Isles. He made several naval expeditions to the west coast, including one in 1540, in which he took a number of Highland chiefs hostage to guarantee their good behavior. The MacLeans navigated this period by the combination of occasional submission and sustained independence that characterized the most successful of the Highland clans in their dealings with the lowland crown. Hector More was described in the clan tradition as good, kind, and brave, a characterization that suggests either genuine personal qualities or the retrospective satisfaction of a clan remembering a period when it was powerful, and its chief conducted himself creditably. The MacLean territory was extensive, the castle at Duart was strong, and the clan's galley fleet gave it a military capability that the Crown found difficult to suppress without a sustained and expensive naval commitment. The Protestant Reformation that swept Scotland from the late 1550s onward created new political alignments that cut across the old clan divisions. Hector More's death in 1568 left the clan entering this new world with a strong base at Duart, but with the Campbell threat now given an ideological dimension. The Campbells, who had supported the Reformation and the Protestant party, were now also the representatives of the reforming political culture that was transforming Scotland, while the MacLeans occupied a more ambiguous position whose precise religious and political character would shape the clan's choices in the complex decades ahead. The 45-year rule of Hector More is significant partly because it spanned so much change without the clan's fundamental position being fatally damaged. The defeat at Flodden, the murder of his father by Campbell agents, the abolition of the lordship of the Isles, the Reformation, two royal minorities, and the beginning of the most sustained Campbell expansion in the history of Argyll. All of this happened within his lifetime and during his chieftaincy, and the MacLeans of Duart survived it with their castle intact and their territory still substantially theirs. The relationship between Hector More and James V was one of the more nuanced in MacLean history. James V made his naval expeditions to the west coast specifically to demonstrate that the Crown could reach the island chiefs without depending on the Campbells as intermediaries, and his visits to the Western Hebrides were partly diplomatic demonstrations of royal power. The MacLeans who received or acknowledged royal authority during these expeditions were engaging in a specific form of political theatre, accepting the form of Scottish Crown sovereignty while maintaining the substance of their independent authority in their own territory. This was the same calculation that Lachlan Lubanach had made in obtaining his dowry charter from the MacDonald Lord of the Isles, formalizing in a document a relationship whose actual terms would always be determined by military and economic reality rather than by the charter's language. Duart in Hector More's era was a functioning administrative center, and the castle's role as a place where the chiefs received guests and conducted formal business was essential to this function. The specific spatial organization of the tower house, ground floor storage, first floor, great hall, upper floors for sleeping and private business, followed a standard pattern that served this administrative function well: a space for receiving formally, a space for withdrawing privately, storage for the material wealth of the lordship below. Chapter 8. Lachlan More and the Spanish Armada, the galleon in Tobermory Bay, 1588. In late September or early October 1588, a large and heavily damaged ship limped into Tobermory Bay on the northern coast of Mull. The vessel was the San Juan de Sicilia, originally a Croatian merchant ship called the Broad Martellosi, commandeered into the Spanish fleet, an 800-ton armed cargo carrier and troop transport that had been driven north from the English Channel in the storms following the Armada's defeat, had lost her sails to rags and was carrying approximately 275 soldiers in addition to a crew of 63. The captain was a Croat named Luka Ivanov Kinkovic. The soldiers were commanded by a Spanish aristocrat, Don Diego Tellez Enriquez. The local authority on Mull was Lachlan More MacLean of Duart, Lachlan the Great, the 14th chief, a man described by later historians as the most accomplished and warlike chief that ever held sway at Duart. He was a large man physically. More, great, was applied to him in the literal sense as well as the honorific, and he was a shrewd operator in the specific political environment of the late 16th century West Highlands, where the Clan Campbell rivalry had reached a particularly intense phase. The negotiation between Don Diego and Lachlan More was straightforward in its structure, if not its outcome. The Spanish needed supplies, repair materials, and time to make their vessel seaworthy for the long voyage home around Scotland and back to Spain. Lachlan needed military resources for his ongoing conflict with his neighbors, the MacDonalds of Islay. The deal that was struck gave the Spanish what they needed, and gave Lachlan the use of the ship's 275 soldiers for his own purposes. Lachlan More used the Spanish soldiers to raid the MacDonald territories, the specific target that his own clan rivalry suggested. For several weeks, 275 trained Spanish and Sicilian and Flemish soldiers were essentially MacLean mercenaries, fighting a West Highland clan war in the islands under the nominal command of a Spaniard who had no particular interest in the dispute and a very strong interest in leaving. The ship exploded on November 5, 1588. The explosion killed almost everyone on board. The cause has been debated for over 4 centuries without conclusive resolution. One persistent tradition blames a Scottish agent working for the English government, one Donald Glass MacLean, possibly an Elizabethan spy, who is said to have boarded the ship and ignited the powder store. Another tradition suggests that Lachlan More himself arranged the explosion when the relationship with Don Diego had soured. Whatever the cause, the explosion destroyed a vessel that had been rumored to carry the pay chest of the Armada fleet, and the legend of the Tobermory treasure, the fortune in gold and silver supposedly resting in the silt of Tobermory Bay, was born. Lachlan kept approximately 50 survivors from the explosion, and used them in his feuding for another year before shipping them back to Spain. The wreck became, over the centuries, one of the most persistently sought treasures in Scottish waters. The successive Dukes of Argyll were granted the right to salvage it by Charles I in 1640, and they exercised or attempted to exercise this right repeatedly over the following 3 centuries. The most high-profile attempt, led by the 11th Duke of Argyll with Royal Navy assistance in 1954, recovered some interesting artifacts, but no gold. The bulk of the wreck remains in Tobermory Bay, encrusted with marine growth and contested by historians who disagree about whether it ever carried the treasure it was supposed to have. Chapter 9. Royalists, Cromwell, and the Campbell Siege, the 17th century, 1631 to 1691. The 17th century was the most turbulent in the castle's long history, compressing into 60 years a sequence of religious conflict, civil war, military occupation, political humiliation, and ultimate loss that undid 3 centuries of MacLean power at Duart. Sir Lachlan MacLean was made a baronet of Nova Scotia in 1631, a crown honour that simultaneously recognized the clan's status and indicated the MacLean chief's alignment with the royalist cause that Charles I was attempting to sustain against the mounting pressure of the Covenanting movement in Scotland. When the Wars of the Three Kingdoms erupted in the 1640s, the MacLeans brought their clan to support the Marquess of Montrose, the brilliant royalist general who conducted his famous year of victories across Scotland in 1644–45. Montrose's campaigns brought him briefly to the western coast and generated MacLean military participation in several of the engagements that made up that extraordinary campaign. In 1647, Argyll government troops of Clan Campbell attacked and besieged Duart Castle directly. The MacLeans held them off. The garrison of royalist MacLeans defeated the Campbell force and drove it from the headland, a military success that was also a demonstration that the castle's defensive position remained formidable even in the 17th century, with gunpowder weapons more advanced than anything available to the medieval builders. In September 1653, a Cromwellian naval task force of 6 ships anchored off Duart with the intention of reducing the castle. The MacLeans had already withdrawn to Tiree, the westernmost island of their territory, and Cromwell's ships found the castle abandoned. A storm blew up on September 13th, and 3 ships were lost, including HMS Swan, in the waters off the promontory that had been watching storms for 4 centuries. The wreck of HMS Swan was found by archaeologists in the 1990s in the Sound of Mull, her guns and artifacts preserved in the cold water that had kept them since 1653. The financial crisis that eventually undid the MacLeans was not military defeat, but debt. By 1679, the MacLeans had accumulated debts to the Campbells, their perpetual rivals, now in a position to use economic pressure rather than purely military force, that gave Archibald Campbell, 9th Earl of Argyll, the legal basis for an invasion of Mull. Sir John MacLean, the 4th Baronet, fled Duart and withdrew first to Cairnbogue Castle in Aberdeenshire, then to Kintail under the protection of the Earl of Seaforth. The Campbells occupied Mull. In 1689, the Jacobite Rising offered the MacLeans a political mechanism for recovering what they had lost. The 4th Baronet supported James VII against William of Orange, the same calculation that the Stuarts of Appin made simultaneously, the same alignment of Jacobite loyalty with the hope of recovering what Campbell expansion had taken. The MacLeans regained Duart briefly. In 1691, Sir John MacLean surrendered the castle to Argyll for the last time. The Campbells garrisoned it, and then, in an act of deliberate destruction designed to ensure the castle could never again serve as a MacLean stronghold, demolished much of the walls. Their stones were scattered or repurposed. The walls that Lachlan Lubanach had built in the 1370s, that had watched Red Hector carried to Iona, that had looked out at the empty rock where Catherine Campbell had been left to drown, that had seen the Armada galleon limp into Tobermory Bay, were broken down and their material dispersed. The deliberate demolition of castle walls after a military or political defeat was a standard practice of the period, the same logic that Richelieu had applied to Pierrefonds in France in 1617, and that the English Parliament had applied to royalist fortifications across Britain in the late 1640s. A castle cannot be used as a stronghold against you if you break its walls. The Campbells, having finally and definitively ended MacLean resistance on Mull through the combination of accumulated debt and military force, were not going to leave Duart in a condition that might allow future MacLean recovery to reverse their gains. The specific circumstances of the debt that undid the MacLean position are themselves revealing. By the 1670s, the MacLeans had borrowed so heavily from the Campbells, whose economic position had been strengthened by their consistent support of the government through the Covenanting period and its aftermath, that the legal mechanisms of Scottish law gave the Campbells the right to pursue the debt through seizure of assets. This was not a military victory in the conventional sense. It was a legal one, the kind of slow-motion economic conquest that was ultimately more effective than any number of sieges. The Campbells had been willing to wait for the moment when the MacLeans were financially vulnerable rather than simply militarily strong. The HMS Swan, lost in the storm of September 1653 in the waters off Duart, was found by archaeologists in the 1990s in the Sound of Mull. Her guns and artifacts, preserved by the cold and dark of the seabed, were among the most significant finds in Scottish underwater archaeology. The Cromwellian warship that had come to coerce the MacLeans was lying in the water below the castle that had outlasted the regime that sent her. The castle was eventually demolished by the Campbells. The ship lay in the seabed, visible to divers who know where to look. Chapter 10. 2 Centuries of Ruin and the Return, 1691 to 1912. The castle that the Campbells abandoned after 1691 was not quite the stripped ruin that subsequent neglect would produce, but it was significantly damaged. Its walls partly demolished, its roof and internal fittings gone. The structure that had housed the MacLean chiefs for 3.5 centuries reduced to a defensible shell without the components that made it habitable. The MacLean clan chiefs, scattered from their ancestral seat, became what the clan tradition describes as professional soldiers, men who took their military skills and the martial culture that had sustained the clan's power on Mull and applied them in the service of armies that paid wages. MacLeans served in the armies of France and Spain, in the British regular army, and in the various colonial enterprises that the 18th century offered to men of military background and Highland origin. The clan chief was a man without a castle, and the castle on the Black Point at the junction of the Sound of Mull stood empty and deteriorating. The castle passed through a series of ownerships that had nothing to do with the MacLeans. Descendants of Archibald Campbell, 1st Duke of Argyll, sold it in 1801 to a Macquarie, who sold it to a Campbell of Possil. Campbell of Possil kept it as a picturesque ruin within the grounds of his own estate to the north, Duart Castle, and later sold the Duart estate to A.C. Guthrie in 1865. The Jacobite MacLeans, who had fought in the 1715 and 1745 risings, the clan chief killed at Culloden was among them, were fighting for a cause partly defined by the desire to recover what Campbell expansion had taken, and the castle at Duart was a specific and material expression of that loss. The MacLean chiefs through the 18th and 19th centuries raised regiments, fought battles, and maintained the clan's military tradition in circumstances quite different from the galley-dominated world of the medieval Hebrides. What the clan lacked was a seat. The castle on the Black Point was a ruin in someone else's estate, its stones being quietly pillaged for local building projects, its walls slowly losing the integrity that had kept them standing since the 1370s. On the 11th of September 1911, the ruin was separated from the rest of the Duart estate and purchased by Sir Fitzroy Donald MacLean, the 26th chief of Clan MacLean, a man who was 75 years old at the time of the purchase. He had been working toward this moment for years, raising funds from MacLean clansmen across the world and managing the legal and financial complexities of extracting the castle from the Duart estate. When he finally had it, he set about restoring it. The restoration was not merely architectural. Sir Fitzroy understood, in a way that heritage agency restorations do not always manage, that Duart was not simply a building, but a home. The home of the clan, the physical expression of MacLean identity that had been missing for 2 centuries. He restored it to be lived in, and he lived in it. He held clan gatherings at Duart that drew MacLeans from Scotland, America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, a diaspora that had never stopped identifying with the island castle on the Black Point, and that now had somewhere to return to. His portrait hangs in the Great Hall. Sir Fitzroy died in 1936, at the age of 100. He had bought a ruin at 75 and lived another 25 years in the restored castle, hosting his clan in the rooms where their ancestors had hosted theirs. The gathering of MacLeans at Duart that Sir Fitzroy organized after the restoration was not simply a nostalgic reunion, it was a political act in the specific sense in which clan gatherings have always been political in Scotland. A demonstration that the clan existed, that it had a chief, that it had a seat, and that the dispersal of the Jacobite defeats and the agricultural changes that had emptied the Highlands of many of their people had not destroyed the fundamental identity that the clan preserved. MacLeans came from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, the descendants of people who had left Mull during the clearances or the earlier migrations, who had retained the MacLean name and the MacLean identity across generations of diaspora, and who were now able to return to the place that name and identity were attached to. The specific act of buying back the ruin was financed by contributions from clan members across the world, which is what made the 1911 purchase different from a simple real estate transaction. Sir Fitzroy was not only buying a building, he was consolidating a community's collective stake in a piece of their history. The restoration itself, carried out by the National Trust of Scotland's architects under Sir Fitzroy's direction, was designed to make the castle habitable rather than merely preservable, to restore it as a home rather than as an exhibit. This is why Duart feels, even today, more like a living house than most castle visitor attractions. It was restored to be lived in, and it has been lived in by the MacLean chiefs since 1911. The 20th century added further layers to the castle's long accumulation of history. The MacLeans, who had risen in 1715 and 1745, with the clan chief killed at Culloden, had paid for their Jacobite loyalty with forfeiture and exile. Sir Fitzroy's purchase and restoration was, among other things, a reversal of this story. The MacLeans returning to Mull after the long aftermath of Jacobite defeat. The castle that had represented their power recovered from the family that had used debt law to take it. Chapter 11. The Sheila na gig, the signal chain, and the architecture of control. The physical fabric of Duart Castle, as it stands today, is a palimpsest of the different periods of building and rebuilding that its history has generated. The 13th century curtain walls that the MacDougalls built, the 14th century tower house that Lachlan Lubanac added, the 16th and 17th century improvements that successive MacLean chiefs made as military technology changed, and the 1911 restoration that made the whole complex habitable again after 2 centuries of ruin. The oldest part of the surviving fabric, the curtain walls, retains one of the more unusual pieces of medieval carved decoration available at any Scottish castle. In one section of the wall is a carving of a Sheila na gig, a medieval figurative sculpture depicting a crouching female figure that appears at a number of medieval buildings across Ireland and Scotland, typically in positions of architectural prominence at gates or doorways. The Sheila na gig is thought to have served an apotropaic function, warding off evil or danger, and its presence at Duart connects the castle to a tradition of protective image-making that predates the MacLean occupation and may even predate the MacDougall fortification. The castle's role in the signal chain that ran along the Sound of Mull, the network of beacon fire stations that allowed information about approaching threats to travel faster than any ship, is documented in the historical record of the region's coastal defenses. Dunolly near Oban at the southern end, Duart at the junction, and Mingari on Ardnamurchan at the northern end formed a chain that could transmit warnings across the full length of the Sound in minutes rather than hours. The MacLean chiefs who lit those beacons were participating in a communication network that predated them and would outlast them, a West Highland early warning system that the geography of the Sound had made logical before any specific clan occupied the headland. The tower house that dominates the castle's profile from the water is the same structure that Lachlan Lubanac built in the 1370s, raised and modified, but essentially the same building on the same foundations. The walls are thick enough to contain wall passages, and the entrance from the ground floor to the upper levels was designed for defense, narrow enough that an attacking force could not rush it en masse, with murder holes above for use against anyone who forced the door. The dungeon, which visitors can see today, is in the basement of the tower, a space that preserved the castle's capacity to hold prisoners even when the administrative functions of the MacLean lordship had long since moved beyond the basic coercion that dungeon possession implied. The view from the battlements is the same view that every MacLean chief had from this position for 3.5 centuries. North up the Sound of Mull toward Tobermory and Ardnamurchan, south into the Firth of Lorne and the approach from Oban, east across to the mountains of Morvern. Every ship moving between the Hebrides and the mainland, every galley carrying trade goods or warriors or messages between the Campbell heartlands and the MacDonald territories, every vessel approaching from Ireland or from the Northern Islands, all of it was visible from these battlements. The MacLeans held the Black Point because the Black Point was where you stood if you wanted to see everything that happened on the west coast of Scotland, and for 3.5 centuries they stood there and watched. Chapter 12. Duart today. The castle that watched Scotland from the sea, Duart Castle, is open to visitors from Easter through October. The ferry from Oban to Craignure brings visitors past the castle's headland on the approach to the terminal, the tower rising from its basalt promontory in the view that has been available to travelers crossing the Firth of Lorne since the 14th century. A road from Craignure runs to the castle in 4 miles. There is also a boat connection from Oban that allows the visit to the castle to be made from the sea, arriving as the MacLean chiefs received their visitors across the water, which is the right way to approach a castle whose identity has always been maritime. The exhibitions inside the castle cover the long and often violent history of the MacLean clan, from the legendary Gillian of the Battle Axe through Red Hector at Harlaw, Lochlan Catanac and Ladies' Rock, Lochlan Moor and the Armada Galleon, the Royalist campaigns of the 1640s, the financial catastrophe that handed Duart to the Campbells, and the restoration by Sir Fitzroy in 1911. The Great Hall, the staterooms, the dungeons, and the battlements are all accessible, each space carrying a different register of the castle's history. The films that have used Duart as a location, When 8 Bells Toll in 1971, Entrapment in 1999 with Sean Connery, who had MacLean ancestry through his mother, and Catherine Zeta-Jones, have given the castle a modern cultural identity that the medieval history would not have generated alone. These film appearances are typical of the way that dramatic castle settings attract dramatic narratives. The location itself is so visually compelling that filmmakers reach for it when they need a castle that looks like what a castle should look like: dark, exposed, commanding, ancient, without looking as though it has been managed into prettiness. Duart has never been pretty. It is dramatic, which is a different thing. The drama is the water and the basalt, and the position at the junction of 3 sea routes, where the Sound of Mull opens into the wider sea, a position that was strategic before it was aesthetic, that was chosen for what it commanded rather than what it looked like, and that has continued to look more like what it actually is than like anything else: the Black Point, the Dark Castle, the long view down the Sound. From those battlements, on a clear day, you can see the same things that the MacLean chiefs saw: the mountains of Morvern across the Sound, the Firth of Lorne opening to the south, the ferries from Oban crossing the water as the galleys did, the rock offshore, Ladies' Rock, marked by its navigation beacon, from which, 5 centuries ago, Clan Campbell was rescued by a passing boat, while her husband watched from this castle window and saw nothing. The castle is still watching. It has been watching for 800 years, and the sea it watches has not changed.